Thank you, Tina. That's very kind. I should say my title tonight is a different one. The topic I want to talk about is who are we? And the fundamental point is the contradictions in the Australian character. So forgive me if it's an existential question. And I should also say, here's a warning, if you are of a conservative political leaning, especially if you are pleased to see Scott Morrison re-elected as Prime Minister, you'd probably better sit quietly, sit on your hands or leave soon. Although if you disagree with me profoundly, I'd be very happy to debate the point. A point I will make later is that Scott Morrison, in my opinion, is the most dishonest, hypocritical parliamentarian we've ever had in this country and the worst Prime Minister we're ever likely to have. He's a footnote to Donald Trump. Anyway.
Don't hold back.
Okay. Now for the controversial bits. I was interested to hear Sally acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we meet on. In Melbourne, where I come from, you cannot go to a public event without someone standing up and acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we meet on, their elders past, present and emerging and so on. And it's very nice, but it's only part of the story. Why do we not also acknowledge that our ancestors took the land from them? And that caused them immense harm, because the connection between Aboriginal people and their land is like the connection between child and parent. For years, until the Mabo case, the High Court of Australia said that ownership was not a conception which Aboriginal people had, and therefore we can't have stolen their land. I think it was a wonderful thing that the Mabo decision went the way it did, deciding that ownership wasn't quite the question. There is no denying the importance of the link between Aboriginal people and the land, and it's something we never acknowledge. And we don't acknowledge that we added to the harm done by taking their land off them by taking their children off them. The damage we did by that is astonishing, and to be candid, and this is my own fault, I was not aware of it until I did a case in the South Australian Supreme Court for a bloke called Bruce Trevorrow. Bruce was born in November 1956 at 1 Mile Camp Meningie. Meningie is a very small town on the Coorong in South Australia. 1 Mile Camp was an Aboriginal settlement a mile outside Meningie, just a settlement of flattened out oil drums and sackcloth to make humpies. And it was a mile outside Meningie because in November 1956, when Bruce was born, it was unlawful for Aboriginal people to live nearer than 1 mile to a place of white settlement unless they had a permit. Think about that, 1956. Anyway, on Christmas Day 1957, Bruce, 13 months old, got very sick. Some people in Meningie who had a car took him up to the Children's Hospital in Adelaide, which is about an hour's drive, and the hospital records show that a week later, with proper treatment, he was better, and a week after that, he was given away to a white family who lived in suburban Adelaide. Now, the family who took him, or were given him, had a daughter who was 16 at the time. She came along and gave evidence in Bruce's case as a woman in advanced middle age, and she said that her mother had always wanted a second daughter. They saw an ad in the paper offering Aboriginal babies. Just come along and get one. And so instead of going and looking at display homes that weekend, they went to the hospital and they saw a lineup of Aboriginal kids, and they saw a cute curly-headed little girl at one end of the lineup. And so they said, we'll take her. She was handed over to them. They took her home, and when they changed her nappy, they discovered she was a boy. That's how Bruce was given away. Now, when he was 9, Bruce began showing signs of psychological trouble. He was taken to the recently founded Child Guidance Clinic in South Australia, where he was assessed as having no idea of who he was or where he belonged. The South Australian Department of Aborigines had received a letter from Bruce's mother, Thora Lampard, saying, you know, how's my boy Bruce going? I haven't forgotten I've got a boy in there. When can he come home? And they wrote back saying, the doctors say he's doing quite well, but he's not well enough to come home yet. That was written months after they'd given him away. Now, when Bruce turned 10, he was allowed, I mean, the department kept his mother from finding out where he was for years until he was 10. Then the law had changed. They couldn't keep them apart any longer, and so he was allowed to meet his mother and 2 of his siblings. Now, that meeting was interesting, and Bruce was kind of curious that these other strange people were part of his family. They were, in fact, his real family. And it was arranged that he would go down to where they were living at Victor Harbour, I think for the following Easter. And so a lady from the Aborigines department came round to Bruce's house in suburban Adelaide. He was put on the bus to go to Victor Harbour. And when the bus had left, his foster mother said, he's too much trouble, I won't have him back. And so the department posted his toys and his clothes after him. That's how Bruce was reunited with his natural family. Now, it is almost beyond belief to think that anyone would be treated that way. Bruce had a troubled, he had difficulty managing his natural family. He tried to walk from Victor Harbour to Adelaide. This is a 10-year-old boy. He tried to walk from Victor Harbour to Adelaide, got picked up by the police, spent the rest of his childhood in state care, and then had a life which was sort of characteristic of young Aboriginal men without any particular education, you know, occasional brushes with the legal system because of you know, occasional dips into crime and this and that. Every time he got in trouble with the law, Bruce was sent off to get a psych report. And every psych report from the age of 18 through to the age of early 40s said that he seemed to have no idea of who he was or where he belonged, just like the child guidance clinic had said when he was 9. Now, I was privileged to be asked to act for Bruce. There'd been 2 previous silks in it, but they had been appointed to the bench, and so the brief came to me. And I remember leaving court one day and Bruce said, you know, that judge, he's been quite nice to me. Because it occurred to me, it was the very first time in his life Bruce had ever been in a court of his own volition. Every other time it's because he'd been summoned to court by the police. As it happens, on the 1st of August 2007, we got judgment from the Supreme Court of South Australia. It took a very long time, and I actually thought the judge was stitching us up. But we got judgment in Bruce's favour, and he got damages totalling around about $800,000. He is the first and still the only member of the Aboriginal community who have been found by a court to have been unlawfully taken and to have suffered damage and to be compensated as a result. Now, later that year, as some of you will remember, Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister for his first round, and he announced that the first business of the new Parliament would be an apology to the stolen generations. That was interesting. He also, because he's Kevin Rudd, wanted a number of Aboriginal people in the public gallery of the House of Reps when he made his apology. And Bruce had 2 brothers, Tom and George Trevorrow. They had not got sick. They had not been removed from their family because the department had assessed the family as pretty good. And they grew up to be Aboriginal leaders of the Ngarrindjeri community, which is the community around the Coorong. And they got invited to be in the public gallery for the apology. Bruce was not invited. We sent a little reminder to the bureaucrats who quickly hurried out an invitation, and Bruce got there and he was very proud. But it's important to bear in mind that he died the following June, just short of his 52nd birthday. Younger than average male Aboriginal life expectancy, but a person who'd been beaten down by the existence that he had lived. Now, I learned a few interesting things about it from Bruce. One was the importance of the connection between Aboriginal people and the land. The second was the extraordinary damage done when you take a child from their parents. Bruce, as I say, was taken when he was very little. I noticed that he was virtually incapable of having meaningful dealings with any human being older than about 18 months. And he was a terrible father as a result of that, and he was a pretty hopeless husband. So the damage he suffered has been passed on to his children, and they no doubt will pass it on in some diluted way to their children. Why is it? Why is it that in this country we acknowledge routinely the Aboriginal people who had the land before we came along just a couple of hundred years ago, and yet we forget what damage we have done to them? What is it about our character that makes it almost impossible for us to recognise the harm which we have done to the people whose land we acknowledge? My next subject, which I think is also a source of great inconsistency in our attitudes, is the idea of female equality. Australia was one of the first countries in the world to give women the vote in 1902. Then in 1972, the Commonwealth Parliament passed an act providing for equal pay for women doing equal work. But these days, ask most women whether they get equal pay, and most of them will say, well, no. And the fact is that by the age of 30, most women's superannuation account is $10,000 less valuable than 30-year-old men. Now, what does that tell you about equality? Consider this. If men and women were treated equally, as we pretend, do you think anything would change if men had babies instead of women? If you can answer that confidently, no, then we've reached equality. But if you're uncertain, or if you actually think that things might change, then clearly we have not achieved anything like equality. What is the heartland of Australian character? All the early songs, all the early poems, all the early writings, and even the recent writings will tell you the idea of a fair go is central to the Australian character. Julia Gillard spoke about it in 2011. Malcolm Turnbull spoke about it in 2015. And our present, a shocking Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, remember him saying, a fair go for people that will give a fair go to people who have a fair go. Well, I think there are quite a few people in Manus and Nauru who would doubt that, because they have done, well, a fair go. Do we really think we give people a fair go? This obviously ties in with my concern about our treatment of refugees. Let me tell you a story from very early on in my time dealing with refugees. An Iranian family, not Muslim by the way, but an Iranian family, mum and dad and two daughters, left Iran very hurriedly one night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, in awful circumstances. They headed south and they managed to get themselves to Australia via a boat person or a people smuggler from Indonesia. On Christmas Island, from Christmas Island they were taken to Woomera Detention Centre in the South Australian desert. Woomera Detention Centre was a pretty tough place, and at the end of about 15 or 18 months, all of the family were doing it hard, but especially the 11-year-old girl, Martab. Martab had completely given up. She had stopped eating, she'd stopped grooming herself, she'd stopped brushing her hair, she'd stopped brushing her teeth. She was frightened to go to the toilet block, which was a couple of 100 metres from the cabin they were in. She would wet the bed every night, she would wet her clothes every day. A psychiatrist in Adelaide was so concerned when he heard about her condition that he went to Woomera, spoke to the family and spoke to Martab, and delivered a devastating psych report to the department. It said that she had already suffered beyond the human capacity to endure. He said that it was essential that she get daily psychiatric help. And back then, in Woomera, if you needed psychiatric help, you might get to see the visiting psychiatrist Once every 6 or 7 months, she needed daily psychiatric help. The department, to their minimal credit, moved the family from Woomera in the South Australian desert to Maribyrnong Detention Centre in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and that's where I first met them. Their visa application was being looked after by Con Karapanagiotidis of the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre, which had only been operating then for about 8 months or so. Anyway, although the reason for moving the family to Maribyrnong was that Martab needed daily psychiatric help, for the first few weeks of their time in Maribyrnong, nobody came to see her. Not a psychiatrist, not a doctor, not a nurse, not a social worker, nobody. It was as if they hadn't arrived. On a Sunday night in May of 2002, while her mother and father and her young sister were off in the mess hall having dinner, Martab, alone in their cell, took a bedsheet and hanged herself. But she's only little and she didn't know how to tie the knot, so she's still strangling when the family came back from dinner. So she and her mother were taken to the general hospital nearby, and but they were accompanied by 2 ACM guards, so that as a matter of legal analysis, they're still in immigration detention. I don't think Martab was in any condition to make a run for it. They were taken to the hospital at about 9 o'clock that night. Con heard about it, went to the hospital about 9:30 and said good day to the guards who he knows well, and he said, I just want to speak to the mother to see if there's anything I can do to help. And the guards said, no, you're not allowed to see them because lawyers visiting hours in immigration detention are 9 to 5, and they sent him away. And he then rang me at home, and I thought, well, now how do we fit that in with our conception of a fair go? How does anyone in this country think that that sort of treatment of a child is consistent with the idea of a fair go, which we pat ourselves on the back about? What about the use of offshore places for processing, compulsory offshore processing, introduced by the Gillard-Rudd government and then ramped up by the subsequent Abbott government? We say if you come to Australia, you will be taken by force against your will to Nauru in the South Pacific, almost on the equator, or Manus Island, north of the mainland of Papua New Guinea and part of Papua New Guinea, and also almost on the equator, and there you will stay. And when at the 2013 election, remember the 2013 election? Both major parties tried to outdo each other with their promises of cruelty to boat people. It was beyond belief. They both promised to maximise the cruelty to boat people as a deterrent. It occurred to me at the time, if they'd been promising cruelty to kittens, they would have lost. But cruelty to human beings, including children, that was fine. That was a vote winner. The 2013 election resulted in Tony Abbott becoming Prime Minister. I might revise what I said about Morrison. Tony Abbott appointed Morrison as his Immigration Minister. One of the first things that Morrison did as Immigration Minister was to issue a directive in the department that that group of people who in the statute, the Migration Act, are called unauthorised maritime arrivals and who colloquially are referred to by us as boat people, he said that group should thereafter be referred to as illegal maritime arrivals. Now, all of you will be familiar with the use of the term illegal as a description from the right of politics to describe boat people. Let me tell you, just in case there's any uncertainty in the room, they do not commit any offence at all by arriving the way they do. It is not an offence to come to Australia without a visa and ask for protection under the Refugees Convention. They are not illegal. Calling them illegal and pushing them away is now called border protection. So the average punter reading the Murdoch press thinks that we're being protected from criminals, which would make sense if it was true, but it's false. And it's a lie which has been uttered more often by Scott Morrison than I think any other politician in this country. Scott Morrison is breathtaking. Scott Morrison gave his maiden speech in the Parliament on the 14th of February 2008, I think, he said this, and forgive me for reading. I turn now to the most significant influences on my life, my family and my faith. Family is the stuff of life, and there is nothing more precious. For me, faith is personal, but the implications are social, as personal and social responsibilities are at the heart of the Christian message. He also quoted Desmond Tutu, and he quoted Desmond Tutu as saying, "We expect Christians to be those who stand up for the truth, to stand up for justice, to stand on the side of the poor and the hungry, the homeless and the naked." And he was inspired to add then, "These are my principles." Well, it's lucky he told us, because you wouldn't have noticed it from the way he behaves. That's why I call him a hypocrite, because he came into Parliament expressing those as his principles, and yet everything he does is a direct contradiction of his principles. He is willing to mistreat innocent human beings by calling them illegal, by locking them up, and saying how important family is. Do you remember the deal that was struck between the Turnbull government and Obama, where America would take a number of our asylum seekers, because ending up in USA is obviously much less attractive than ending up in Australia. Actually, nowadays it probably is. But the thing about that is that just recently I got an email from a bloke who was on Manus saying that he's just been selected to go to America. He wants to come to Australia. He's probably the only person held on Manus who does want to come to Australia now. He wants to come to Australia because his wife and children are here. But Scott Morrison repeatedly says you will never be allowed to live in Australia. So much for his valuing the family, so much for his Christian principles. He's a dishonest hypocrite. And I am happy to debate that with anyone, including him. I've been saying that, by the way. I've been calling him a dishonest hypocrite publicly for a few years now, and I've not had even the dignity of a simple legal letter saying, stop saying untrue things about him. He probably knows what my reply would be. Against the background of Morrison's horrible behaviour is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's easy to overlook the fact that Australia had a significant role in the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was Eleanor Roosevelt's great project at the end of the Second World War. It was accepted, I think, unanimously in the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 10th of December 1948. And Australia, although our population was only 7.5 million back then, we made a very significant contribution to it. And as it happens, Doc Evatt, an Australian, presided over the General Assembly of the UN when the Universal Declaration was adopted. I just want to read 3 paragraphs from the preamble to give you an idea of the disparity between what we contributed to and embraced and what we do in fact. It begins, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. And whereas it's essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. That is a document in which we had a very significant role in formulation. It doesn't fit very comfortably with our treatment of asylum seekers in recent times. It does not fit at all comfortably with our treatment of members of the Aboriginal community these days, and for a long time, for 213 years or whatever it is, it simply does not seem to fit in very well with Australia's current mentality, driven as it is by the mentality of the United States at the moment, which is a reflection of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's behaviour at the moment, the striking fact that the killer at El Paso actually recited some of the words that Donald Trump had used in his anti-Mexican statements. And on the very day that Donald Trump visited El Paso, ostensibly to see how the people were doing, but no members of the press were allowed to be there, on the very day that he visited El Paso, the ICE unit, what is it? International Cooperation and Enforcement, or whatever it is, anyway, the ICE department of the American Immigration Department executed raids in Minneapolis, specifically taking Mexican, Latino members out of 3 factories, leaving their children alone at school, in daycare, or wherever they were. They actually raided premises to take 800 Latino workers and leave their children sobbing in the streets, wondering where their parents were. Now, that's the sort of mentality of Donald Trump, and I'm afraid that mentality is becoming increasingly apparent in this country. Whether there's a link between the two, I'm not sure, but maybe it's Morrison's punishment that he has to deal with Trump. The Universal Declaration is important in a different way. I think the Universal Declaration represents the starting point of the modern thinking about human rights. And it's not surprising. I mean, after something as appalling as the Holocaust, it's not surprising that the world should stop and take a deep breath and reconsider the way human beings are treated. But if that was the start of modern human rights discourse, September 11 seems to be the bookend at the other end of it, because human rights has been less respectable to talk about or think about since September 11. And incidentally, September 11 is significant in another way. Because of my involvement in the Tampa case, I remember the chronology of it fairly well. The trial judgment in the Tampa case was handed down in Melbourne at 2:15 in the afternoon, Melbourne time, on the 11th of September 2001, 8 or 9 hours before the attack on America. And it was after the attack on America that John Howard, who was in Washington at the time, started calling boat people illegal. Now, there's one other matter which I think highlights the disparity between what we think and what we do, and that is our anti-terrorism laws. We have some of the harshest anti-terrorism laws in the world. They are extraordinarily harsh. Now, of course, I mean, terrorism is always an offence. Why it is necessary to have laws that are as harsh as ours is an interesting question. But consider how bad terrorism is in Australia. The most recent actual genuine terrorist attack in Australia was the Hilton bombing in, I think, 1978. Okay? The biggest death toll from a terrorist event in Australian history was 27 people. And that event was in 1854, the Eureka Stockade. It is an interesting thing that the Eureka Stockade is now held up as one of our great historical moments, and yet it was a terrorist event. Now, given that the death toll associated with terrorist acts in Australia is relatively small, in fact, both here and in America, apparently you're more likely to die falling off a ladder than in a terrorist event. It is curious that we do so much to combat terrorism and yet so little to combat domestic violence. We know that 50 women a year die as a result of domestic violence, and yet we concentrate on terrorism, which claims very few lives indeed. So why is it? What is it about this country? I mean, who the hell are we if we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land but don't acknowledge our role in reducing them to their present condition? If we regard equality of the sexes as important and yet women do not get a fair go, if we think that a fair go is important and yet we mistreat asylum seekers the way we do, despite our contribution to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and if we think that saving lives with harsher and harsher anti-terrorism laws is sensible, what about having a go at domestic violent deaths, which are real and claim so many lives every year? I really think it is time for all of us to stop and pause and say, who are we? What are we going to do to get ourselves to being what we believe we are? Thank you. Sure.
So if you have a question, please just stand up or raise your hand. Yes. Crystal?
That's right, I can speak loud. Thank you so much for your insights. It's really great to have you here at Burgmann, and I really thank you for coming today. I just wanted to sort of touch bases on a Bill of Human Rights and whether that ever eventually happened, what effect you think that would actually, tangible systemic change that would have on the topics that you've spoken about, so, and namely Indigenous rights.
Okay, so for those of you at the back who mightn't have heard the question amounts to, if we had a Bill of Human Rights, would that make a difference? Roughly it?
Yep.
Okay. I think the answer is yes, it would. In Victoria, we have a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Here in the ACT, you've got a Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights is a difficult expression because it suggests the American Bill of Rights, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a Bill of Human Rights. It would at least give us a toolkit. You know, in Victoria, we've got a very weak model Bill of Rights. The best thing you can say about it is that it has not turned out to be a lawyer's feast. Because one of the great fears with protecting human rights is that it will become good for lawyers. And since lawyers are horrible and feasts are good, how do you work that out? I think that's the way the argument works. It would be very nice to be able to go to a court and talk about human rights issues instead of fossicking around the edges of administrative law, saying that, you know, they took into account irrelevant considerations or misunderstood a relevant legal test. The Martab's case, that little girl, Martab, after she got out of the general hospital, she spent 12 months in the Austin Hospital's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Unit until she was assessed as well enough to be put back in detention, and they put her back in detention. I mean, it's breathtaking. Any effective human rights protection would prevent that sort of treatment of individual people. What is difficult about I mean, given that 9/11 was the turning point, I had a very interesting time just a couple of years ago. I was in Berlin, and it's the very first time that I'd been to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which is, I think, 3,000 enormous slabs, carved slabs of rock of various sizes going over a hill. I mean, it covers maybe an acre or so. And so it's interesting that it represents the death of about 6 million people. And that means that if you stand beside just 2 of those rocks, just 2 of them represent the number of human beings who died on September 11. And yet, whereas those 3,000 rocks represent the starting point of human rights discourse, 2 of them represent the end point of human rights discourse. Now, I suspect that many people in Australia take the view that human rights actually don't matter except for my own. And that just doesn't work. You know, if you think your human rights are important, then everyone's human rights are equally important. If everyone's human rights could be protected, I think we would be a better country. But of course, getting parliamentarians to agree to that is more difficult.
Thank you, Mr. Burnside. As much as we can criticise politicians, it's interesting to know obviously that Australia decisively appeared to vote for the current government. So what is your thoughts on that? Because as much as we can take to the streets about climate or protest in regards to refugees, do you think that Australia as a whole can support humane political policies long term, even if it might appear to conflict with their self-interest?
That's an interesting question. I think the starting point is, does respect for individual human rights conflict with self-interest? And I think the answer to that has to be a resounding no, because any government which is willing to sacrifice the rights of one unpopular group will undoubtedly move on and sacrifice the rights of other groups. And you know, there's that famous observation by Martin Niemöller. When they came for the trade unionists, I said no. When they came for the communists, I said nothing because I'm not a communist. When they came for the trade unionists, I said nothing because I'm not a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I said nothing because I'm not a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one to speak for me. I think we all ought to understand the point which is being made in that brief statement. It's all very well to stand back, if you must, stand back and watch the human rights of others being sacrificed. Wait until it's your turn, and then self-interest will turn you around, I think. Trouble is, most of us live with the complacent notion in Australia that if you're white and sort of Christian, then you'll be okay. Because, well, hey, what's Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison going to do to you? I guess journalists might have thought that until recently. No one is safe. When governments have a sense of what they can do and get away with, they will do it. I'm sorry, but I'm very cynical about the way governments behave.
Just picking up on that last point, what's your views then on the Witness K prosecution and the prosecution of Bernard Collaery, the former Attorney General of this territory? If governments are going to do what they can get away with?
I think it's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. I mean, my understanding, and this is from Bernard, so it's possibly coloured. My understanding is that Witness K was in trouble for having revealed the fact that our government was spying directly on the East Timorese government in connection with negotiations that we were having with them at the time. Outrageous behaviour. And he got in trouble because he disclosed that. And Bernard was acting for him in the International Court of Justice. And while Bernard was at the ICJ, the federal police raided his office, his legal office, and took his papers. Papers which on any view must have been privileged. And they prosecuted him and his client on account of those events. Now, I don't think, from what I know of it, and I don't know the whole story, but from what I know of it, Bernard did not break any law. He was simply defending someone who had arguably broken the law. I think it's a blight on the legal system that those two have been prosecuted. Australia should be a bit more respectable than that. I mean, why has Witness K been prosecuted? he called us out for misbehaving, for acting dishonestly. Well, I guess that explains it. Yeah, it's...
That's really about what goes to what you were saying about governments doing what they can get away with.
What they can get away with, yeah.
And I guess for some time now I've been concerned that our system of government is broken, and Commissioner Haynes made that observation the other day. We theoretically have this separation of powers in this country, but to me there's no longer balance. The power of the executive relative to the parliament, relative to the judiciary, is far too great. I think we've got a constitutional problem. How can we possibly correct that constitutional problem? And just to add to that, we no longer have, it seems to me, the protection of an independent head of state, of the head of state being in the gift of the Prime Minister, coming and going as the Prime Minister pleases. So I really do wonder whether our system is utterly broken.
That's a big question. I don't think it's functioning very well. Whether it's broken is another question. I don't think having a nominal powerless head of state is a great problem. I do think the separation of powers is still a strong idea legally, and it comes from an American decision and was decided very early by the High Court that the structure of our constitution meant that the three powers of government are separate. Although when you raise a separation of powers argument in the High Court, sometimes it will be seen as exercise of the judicial power of the Commonwealth, and other times it won't be. Al-Khatib's case is a very interesting example of that. I wonder how many people in the room have heard of Al-Khatib's case. Yeah. That's impressive though.
Oh, it's always impressive. It's boring.
Okay. Okay.
And that's my mother-in-law.
Yeah. Al-Khatib and Godwin was a case which raised this question. There was a stateless Palestinian who'd come here as a boat person. He'd been put in detention. And the prospects of getting him anywhere in the world or getting him back to Palestine was regarded as negligible. So, separation of powers question. Given that it is punishment to jail a person, and punishment is the exclusive province of the judicial arm of government, how is it that the executive arm of government can simply keep him there? And the answer was, well, as long as there is some prospect of finding a place for him to go, it's administrative detention, it's not prison. Okay? So no breach of the separation of powers, it's just the executive doing what it's able to do. That's a, yeah, I agree with your shaking your head. It was, yeah, it's a real pity. But the idea of locking up people who've done nothing worse than come here asking to be protected from persecution shouldn't result in people being jailed. Because we can say it's administrative detention, it's not prison. Well, go and have a look in a detention centre and see what it looks like. It looks like a prison, feels like a prison. To them, it feels like a prison. I was talking about Manus and Nauru before. I wonder how many people know. Nauru is an independent republic. Its land area is 2 square kilometres smaller than Tullamarine Airport. It is a tiny, tiny country. Now, that hasn't answered your question at all, but what other bits do you want me to touch on? I actually, can I say, I think, although we do have problems, I think the problem is with the parliamentarians who want to pander to the public by doing things that look popular. And so if if you can bag people by calling them illegal, and if you can gain votes by mistreating them, then you'll do it. And they do. And they're very careful to do it in a way that doesn't breach the separation of powers. It's very sad. All that said, can I say, although I disagree with a number of the judgments of a number of our courts, and Al-Kateb and Godwin is one of the judgments I particularly dislike, I have never doubted for a minute that our judges are conscientious and honest and decide cases as they see them. We have a great deal to be proud of in our judicial system. It's just that our parliamentarians are such a scurvy lot that they do things which leave the courts almost nowhere to go.
I wondered, Julian, trying to draw some of the threads that you've given us, one of them that appealed to me was the story, the personal narrative of the clients that you've had. And in refugee cases, it's typically redacted to an acronym. We don't tend to hear about the story that lives behind them. And I was also thinking about the impact intergenerationally of that incarceration and immigration detention. Can you give us your sense, your take on those, perhaps those issues, the personal story that we miss when we pick up those cases? We see those acronyms, but we don't hear the story, and we don't hear what you've given us about Mr. Trevorrow. We don't hear that story of intergenerational effects.
Yeah. I agree with the observation, and I think the reason is because the press is too lazy or too craven to tell the full story. Because, I mean, how could you run the Murdoch line of supporting offshore processing and yet tell the individual stories of the people who are being locked up and mistreated that way? The government has very quietly brought all the children off Nauru, and they pat themselves on the back for having got all the kids off Nauru. I've done cases for children on Nauru with the purpose of bringing them to Australia for proper treatment. The kids on Nauru were in a terrible condition. They had fallen into despair. And there was one kid who was aged 10, I think, and she had made a series of red hot goes at trying to kill herself. And there was, I mean, because Nauru is so small, there was no realistic prospect of her getting adequate medical treatment over there. And that was almost an agreed fact. It was plain on the evidence that she couldn't be treated adequately there. And at the first hearing of the case on interlocutory basis, in front of a judge who I'm not really all that keen on, counsel for Dutton said, "You shouldn't make any orders bringing the child to Australia until the trial of the action." And the judge looked at him and said, "The trouble is she may be dead by then." Which I thought reflected very well on the judge. I suppose if I was in Dutton's shoes, I wouldn't have liked it.
Can I say something? I did work on the asylum. I also worked in 2 other detention centres. And if you want to organise something, I'm very happy to have a conversation group about it. I can tell you all of the nitty-gritty.
But the difficulty with that is, what do you organise? I mean, and that was, I think, the heart of your question. How do we organise actions which will galvanise the public so as to send a message to parliamentarians: we are not like this. We are better than this. And I believe that Australians are better than what we're doing. And the short answer is, I don't know. I mean, what are you, demonstrations like we had with the Vietnam War?
No.
That's so 1960s, 70s.
So given all of that, and given the myriad problems that we haven't talked about tonight, ranging from lack of energy policy through to the fact that we can't manage water, through to the fact that the NBN's broken, through to the fact that
The present government doesn't think that climate change is real or manageable. Yeah.
why is it that the Australian voter re-elected the Morrison government?
At the risk of sounding like a lawyer, I'm fucked if I know. I wouldn't have believed it, you know. I don't know. But I think your point about the hip pocket nerve, self-interest, is probably the answer. I mean, the Liberals ran a wholly negative campaign. They said that Labor were going to introduce death taxes, which may be relevant sooner than everyone wants. So it made, and you know, Paul Keating it was who said that in any two-horse race, put your money on self-interest for a win because you know it'll be trying hard. And it wouldn't surprise me if it was something as miserable as that. You know, it brings to mind what Oscar Wilde once said. He said, "We all live in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." Now, I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
Thank you. I wanted to just take us back to the anti-terrorism legislation, because this is particularly, I think, for the younger people in the room. My understanding is that the definition of anti-terrorism is actually quite broad, and it's really about the national interest. And the risk is that people who are increasingly people who are protesting against, trying to defend environmental interests could be targeted as potential terrorists, and that. So I'm interested in the legal understanding of, you know, what can we expect from this anti-terrorism legislation in the future?
At its heart, terrorism offences are any conduct that would otherwise be an offence and which is done for an ideological reason. So whether it's political, social, religious or whatever. But in association with that, we've got various things like control orders where a person who is thought to be a terrorist can be locked up for a time. Very interesting. England had a similar problem. England has a Human Rights Act, which is necessary because they're part of the EU for the time being, and they have to have domestic legislation which mirrors the European Charter of Human Rights. A few years ago, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, the English Parliament passed an act which said if a person's a refugee, which means in substance that they can't be removed from England, and if they are a suspected terrorist, they can be locked up for up to 12 months to preserve the life of the nation. And preserve the life of the nation is the get out clause in the English human rights legislation, so that you can contradict the rights which are protected if that contradiction is necessary to preserve the life of the nation. So naturally this very quickly goes to the House of Lords to see whether it's valid or not, and the House of Lords decided, I think it was 8-1, might have been 7-2, that it was not valid. And Lord Hoffmann finished his speech with a very telling point. Lord Hoffmann was a relatively conservative member of the House of Lords. He finished his speech saying, the life of the nation is less threatened by terrorism than by laws like these. Now, that puts us in a very bad light, if you think about it, because we just lock people up. The people on Manus have mostly been locked up there for 7 years or 6 years. The people on Nauru, most of them, 6 years. There are people in immigration detention in Australia at the moment who've been in immigration detention for up to 9 years. So what is it that we think it's okay to lock up people who've not been convicted of any offence at all? So.
They've also been cleared through the UNHCR
Yeah.
in Indonesia as legitimate refugees. And to call Manus or Nauru processing centres is just ludicrous because they're not being processed. Yeah.
She speaks the truth from a position of greater knowledge than I have.
In relation to Australia's refugee policy, I'm just wondering, as you were saying, the current policy has come about through a combination of Labor and Liberal governments. So if the Morrison government were to be replaced by a Labor government at the next election, how vast do you think the changes would actually be? How much do you think the Labor government would live up to their promises to get the refugees?
That's a very good question, and it depends on the balance of power between the factions in Labor. I happen to know a couple of people in the Labor Party who are very much of my opinion in relation to refugees. But the opposite faction is dominant, I think, by a small margin at the moment. So it will depend on who controls the party. I don't know whether I can tell a story about Bill Shorten. Probably shouldn't.
Go for it, Julian.
Okay. Chatham House rules. I told you about the directive that Morrison brought in when he became Immigration Minister, that the group who are known in the statute as unauthorised maritime arrivals must be referred to by officers of the department hereafter as illegal maritime arrivals. Now, it struck me that created the perfect opportunity for a simple case in the federal court for a declaration that that's an unenforceable directive, because the minister cannot order public servants to lie. Okay? Simple. Nice, simple case theory. Bill Shorten contacted me not long after the Abbott government came in, said there were a number of things he wanted to talk to me about. And although why anyone would want my political advice is a mystery, but he came round one Sunday afternoon and I hijacked the first 20 minutes of the meeting. I explained to him very carefully this case theory. And I said, look, the only person with standing to bring an application like this would be an officer of the department who's bound by it, ostensibly, or the union having coverage. Now, Bill had been very useful to me when he was head of the AWU, because he used to help stop people being removed from Australia when there was reason to stop it and so on. So I said, look, can you get me the CPSU? Because they would be a perfect applicant for that declaration. He did nothing. Nothing at all. So, the front row's nodding.
That's why we both voted green, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
You briefly mentioned the Murdoch press before, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on, I guess, the role that media should play, and I guess if you think greater regulation should be introduced in media in the future.
I think the easiest way to answer that is to consider the difference between the news coverage in The Guardian Australia on the one hand and the Herald Sun, the Australian, the commercial TV channels, and to a lesser extent the ABC. And in the difference between them, you see the answer. What percentage of the Australian public get their news from the Murdoch press as opposed to the Guardian Australia? Now, I don't like the idea of a government that tells the press how they should cover any issue. But the fact is, in a small country with a very tightly controlled press, we have a serious imbalance. And that's a pity, because the fact that any government can get away with calling boat people illegal falsely for years on end is breathtaking. I believe, and I really have to believe this, that if most Australians understood that it's a lie to call boat people illegal and that we don't need to be protected from them, that then the attitudes in the public would change. I believe that. I believe that if people were forced to remember that the traditional owners of the land on which we meet had it taken off them by our ancestors, that might change people's attitudes just a bit. But let me give you an example of the sort of pathetic coverage you get. And I'm not going to talk about the CAPC meeting yesterday, was it? With Nigel Farage and Janet Albrechtsen and that Tony Abbott. I just distracted myself and I've forgotten what I was going to say to you. An example of, oh yeah, that's right. Aboriginal people now represent 2.7% of the population. And we, especially in Melbourne, we're always acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and so on. So what about a once-off 2.7% tax on all the land that we took in the major capitals? Not the rest, just the major capitals. That would raise billions of dollars. and put that to one side. It is to be held only for the purpose of helping Aboriginal communities around the country. It would do a great deal of good, and the symbolism, I think, would be quite good. Gerard Henderson, who's no close friend of mine, who writes for the Murdoch Press, criticised this suggestion of mine and said, I notice he's not offering to hand over his house in Hawthorne. Well, duh, that wasn't the idea at all. I don't think I'd be mad keen to pay 2.7% on it, but I'd do it because I think the idea is a sensible one.
And his son-in-law is a blackfella.
Hmm?
His son-in-law is a blackfella.
Yeah, but not highly regarded. Let's be honest. I mean, the fact that you have a sentimental attraction to people of this group or that group does not mean that every member of that group is perfect. And I think we ought to be free to criticise.
Can I ask you a question, Julian?
Yeah.
Do you see any parallels between the use of the SAS in the Tampa situation and the use of the federal police in the raids on the ABC?
Okay, for those at the back, the question is there a parallel between the use of the SAS in the Tampa episode and the use of the federal police in the raids on Annika Smethurst and the ABC? Clearly there's a parallel because in both situations you've got the powerful coming to impose their will.
So it reinforces that narrative about these both people are terrorists.
That was actually a little bit before. The Tampa episode was interesting. The Tampa was a Norwegian cargo ship. It was in the vicinity when Australia notified the captain of the Tampa that a little boat from Indonesia called the Palapa had fallen apart in the Indian Ocean and it had refugees on board. We knew all of this stuff and we told the captain of the Tampa and asked him if he'd go and rescue them. So he went to their aid and he told me later that he thought that the Palapa may have had 50 people on board. It turned out, he was amazed when 438 people climbed up the rope ladder, up the side of the ship and onto the deck. Now that gave him a problem because two things. First of all, the Tampa was licensed to carry 50 people. He had 47 crew and all of a sudden 438 unexpected passengers. Second, some of the passengers were in a very difficult state of health. There were pregnant women, there were people who were unconscious, and it was very difficult. So, in the finest traditions of the sea, he decided to head towards Christmas Island, which was on his route, and is part of Australia, and that he would put them ashore at Christmas Island. The Australian government said you're not allowed to enter Australian waters off Christmas Island. He defied the Australian government and stormed into the Australian waters off Christmas Island and was then boarded by the SAS, who took control of the bridge at gunpoint. And that's when the so-called Tampa standoff began, because he wasn't going forward, he wasn't going backwards, and so it was. That was the start of it, but I suppose it may have given the impression that these were shocking people. But certainly I think Howard might have been worried about that because he not only closed the airspace around Christmas Island, he issued a directive that no humanising images of the people rescued were to be published. It's easy to overlook the fact that at that point there was bound to be an election by November, and Howard was not doing well, and it looked as though he might lose at the 2001 election, and this was a last bid attempt to attract a bit of enthusiasm. As it happens, fate dealt him a pretty good hand and September 11 came in on it, and less than 2 months after September 11 was the federal election. And I can tell you, for those of you who weren't here, the atmosphere in Australia was poisonous. The idea of being a Muslim, the idea of saying anything that might be favourable to a Muslim was unthinkable during those 2 months. That's why Kim Beazley ran dead on the issue, and that's a great tragedy, but I can understand why he ran dead on the issue. I have a friend who's an Indian woman who had been in Australia about 16 years at September 11, and for cultural reasons she wears a headscarf. It's not a hijab, but it sort of looks a bit like one. For the very first time in her 16 years in Australia, after September 11, she found herself being spat on in public transport. That's what the atmosphere was like.
I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the experience of those people who have survived the detention camps and moved into the Australian community, and perhaps with a bit of comparison with the Vietnamese refugees who came in '79.
Yeah, look, the Vietnamese refugees, they're often referred to as Vietnamese boat people, are in a different category. Very few of them came directly to Australia by boat. They travelled by boat across from Vietnam to Malaysia, which was about as far as their boats would get them. They were then processed in Malaysia, and Malcolm Fraser, to his credit, said we were part of the problem that made them flee, we should be part of the solution. And so most of them were brought to Australia and other countries by aeroplane. So that's a bit different. Now, the way they were treated not badly from the beginning, I think. They've been embraced in Australian society much more rapidly than the Italians and Greeks after the Second World War, for example. But the experience of people who've been in detention, I'm not sure I'm competent to generalise about that, but I suspect that they are being accepted. It depends on whereabouts you are. I mean, in Dandenong in Melbourne, for example, which is the most multicultural suburb in Australia, the Hazaras almost run the place. I mean, they are an integral part of it and they're embraced. There are other places, of course, like the Lava Duck factory, which depends on them, and they're much valued in places like that. Whether they're equally valued in every other part of Australia, I'm not capable of saying because I don't know. I think an interesting thing about Australians is that once we meet a person face to face, we tend to accept them for what they are. It's a great characteristic. It's not shared by every other culture, and most of the Hazaras I've met from Afghanistan, Pakistan have been really likeable people, and so they tend to be embraced pretty well. Different story. I did a case for a guy who was in Baxter Detention Centre with his 8-year-old daughter. His case was on its way to the High Court. He and his daughter, who was 8, I think, they were in their room in Baxter Detention Centre, which was really like a high-tech prison. They're in their room in Baxter, and there's a knock on the door. 5 guards stormed into their room and ordered him to strip. Now, for some pretty obvious reasons, he refused. Not only the Muslim cultural thing against being naked in front of other people, but his 8-year-old daughter's in the room. And so he refused. So they roughed him up. Their later explanation was that they thought he had a cigarette lighter, which of course is a very, very good reason for roughing up a person who's being held without committing any offence in prison. He was then dragged away, and there was tragic, awful CCTV footage of him being dragged away by these guards across a grassy area in the centre of Baxter, with his little 8-year-old daughter jumping on the back of one of the guards, trying to stop him from taking her father away. He's put into the management unit, and the management unit at Baxter, which had been designed and built for the Howard government, it's actually 13 solitary confinement cells, each about 2.5 metres square. Bare walls, bare concrete walls, bare concrete floor, bare ceiling, minimal furniture. There's like a mattress on the floor, and nothing much else. No company because it's solitary confinement, no privacy either because the lights are kept on 24 hours a day and the room is covered by CCTV footage 24 hours a day. His only respite from his solitude was he was allowed a half-hour visit from his daughter each day, every 24 hours. One day, after he'd been in solitary for a couple of weeks, his daughter did not come. Amin complained to the guy who was in charge of the centre, who said, oh, she's just been taken into Port Augusta nearby, shopping, and she'll be here tomorrow. So tomorrow came and went, the daughter didn't arrive. The same man, the person in charge of the Baxter Detention Centre, came in and said to him, your daughter is now back in Tehran. If you want to see her again, you should abandon your claim for protection and leave. Okay? They had taken her out of the country and returned her to Iran without letting her say goodbye to him. This was at a time when the department was doing all sorts of nasty stuff to Iranians because Iran will not accept failed asylum seekers unless they agree to return to Iran, and most of them, for one reason or another, are not happy to agree. He hadn't even completed his refugee status assessment. He was on the way to the High Court. Anyway, at that point, he had a complete mental breakdown at that point. He spent another 6 or 7 weeks in solitary, and when I was notified about it, we went to court and we got an order getting him out of solitary and moving him to a different detention centre, in fact to Melbourne, where he would not have to face the people who treated him that way. Now, Amin stayed in touch, and he's a complete wreck. He's basically unemployable, and his head is somewhere else. He's in a shocking way. And that is despite the fact that we managed to negotiate a conclusion to his litigation which had his daughter and his wife both brought from Iran to Australia. So he's now back with them, but he is completely broken. So that's the other end of the spectrum.
We have time for just one final question. I was just wondering, is it just self-interest at hand which allows governments to override empathetic capacity, or just what are the other factors?
So is it just?
Self-interest which allows government to override empathetic capacities, or other factors may be at play?
I think it's just self-interest. The alternative is so dark that I hesitate to even think about it, because I think Australia is better than that, even our politicians. Well, that's a line ball thing. I think it's going to keep on like this as long as they think there are votes in it. What the public do not realise is that we have 3 streams of refugees coming into Australia. We've got offshore resettlement people. We go out to camps overseas. We choose refugees. We bring them to Australia. It's a brilliant program. Very few other countries do anything like it, and we should be very proud of it. It's a very, very good thing we do. Not entirely without self-interest. In fact, John Menadue, who used to be the Secretary of the Department under Fraser, tells a story against himself that he was at a refugee camp in Africa, I think, and he said to the head of the refugee camp, have you got any doctors or engineers? And the head of the camp said, I'm afraid we've only got widows and orphans. So, the second stream, there's a quota on that for obvious reasons, because we can't take all the world's refugees. There's a second stream, and that is people who come from countries where they can get a visa to come to Australia. You know, countries that generate a lot of refugees will really have trouble getting a visa to come here because the airline, well, the government knows that they will probably apply for asylum when they get here. So if people can get a visa and can come to Australia, they can clear passport control and then apply for asylum. And the numbers that do that are really quite considerable. All those people are released into the community. They're not a problem to anyone. Most Australians are not aware of their existence. No one cares. and about 30% of them ultimately prove that they're refugees. The third group are the boat people. They come from countries where it's virtually impossible to get a visa to come to Australia, and so their only way of getting to safety here is using people smugglers, which is much more expensive and much more dangerous than flying in. Their numbers, the biggest number ever was 25,000 in 1 year, which was 2012. But before that, the numbers were much, much smaller. And about 90+% of them have historically been established to be genuine refugees. So we mistreat the ones who are almost certainly refugees, and we completely ignore the ones who are probably not refugees. The only reason the government gets away with mistreating the boat people who are almost certainly refugees is self-interest. There are votes in it. And you know, they have no interest in owning up to the fact that they've misled us for years. To their credit, Labor have never they've never used the word illegal, so far as I'm aware. They've never contradicted it, but they've never actually used it. I would love to see a Labor Party attacking the government in question time, saying, why do you call them illegal? You know it's a lie. But until that happens, self-interest will still rule.
We need another Gough Whitlam, that's it.
Yeah, well.